My mother-in-law handed me a cup of tea the morning of my birthday, smiled the way she always did, wide, warm, practiced, and said, "You look tired, sweetheart. Drink up." I wrapped both hands around the mug. It smelled like chamomile and something else I couldn't name. Something faintly bitter underneath the sweetness. I almost drank it. I would have, if my husband hadn't walked in right then and knocked it from my hands. Not by accident. He looked at the mug on the floor, then at his mother, and said absolutely nothing. And the way she looked back at him, no alarm, no apology, just a slow blink and a quiet nod told me everything I needed to know. That was the moment my life split in two. Everything before that spilled tea, and everything after. My name is Mara Calloway. I turned 31 that day. And before this story is over, you're going to understand exactly how deep a person can bury a lie before it becomes a grave. My husband and I had been married for 3 years. His name doesn't matter anymore, so I'll just call him what he turned out to be, my husband in name only. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party, the kind where everyone's trying a little too hard, and the wine is just good enough to make you forget that. He was charming, attentive. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers, which felt rare enough at 31 that I called my best friend the next morning and said, "I think I met someone real." She laughed and said, "Don't jinx it." I should have listened. We moved fast. Engaged after 14 months, married 6 months after that. His mother, who I'll call my mother-in-law because that's the only title she ever earned from me, was present for every step. Always nearby. Always helpful. The kind of helpful that, looking back, felt less like generosity and more like surveillance. My parents had passed when I was in my mid-20s. First my father to a stroke, then my mother to a cancer that moved too fast for any of us to catch our breath. What they left behind wasn't much in the way of cash, but it was a property, a piece of land outside of Asheville that had been in my family for 2 generations. My grandmother had bought it when land out there was still cheap, and by the time it passed to me, developers were circling it like it was the last clean water in a drought. I remember telling my husband about it early on. He'd nodded, asked a few questions, then said something like, "You should really think about what you want to do with that. It's a big responsibility." At the time, I thought he was being thoughtful. Later, I'd understand he was taking inventory. The morning of my birthday, my mother-in-law had come over early, before I was fully awake, which was unusual but not alarming. She'd brought pastries and flowers and her usual performance of warmth. My husband was in the shower. I was in the kitchen in my pajamas, half present, scrolling through birthday texts from old friends. She made the tea herself. Wouldn't let me near the kettle. "Sit down, it's your birthday. Let me do something nice." And I sat, because I was tired and because I had no reason yet not to trust her. When my husband walked in and the mug hit the tile, I waited for someone to explain. He picked up the broken pieces. She dried her hands on the dish towel. Neither of them said a word about it. He told me we'd get breakfast out. She said she had errands. And just like that, the moment passed. Except it didn't pass for me. It lodged somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there all day, a small cold thing I couldn't swallow down. That night, after my husband fell asleep, I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling and thought about the tea. The smell, the knock, the silence that followed. I thought about a conversation I'd overheard 3 weeks earlier, just a fragment, my husband on the phone in his car while I was walking up the driveway. I'd only caught a few words before he saw me and switched to talking about a work project. The words I caught were, "The timeline and before she can file, and we've already waited long enough." I had filed those words away under things I didn't want to examine too closely. That night, I took them back out. By 2 in the morning, I was in his office. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I told myself I was looking for nothing. That I was being paranoid, that I'd poke around and find nothing and go back to bed embarrassed by my own suspicion. His desk was neat the way it always was. He liked order, hated clutter, organized everything in labeled folders and color-coded binders. I almost didn't open the bottom drawer because it was locked, and locked things in a house you share feel like a closed door you agreed not to knock on. But I knew where he kept the key. Same place he'd always kept it. taped flat underneath the corner of the desk itself, so well hidden that I only knew it existed because I'd watched him open that drawer once, years ago, without thinking. He'd forgotten I was in the room. Inside the drawer were three things that changed everything. The first was a manila envelope with my name written on the outside. Not his handwriting. Smaller, neater, more deliberate. Inside was a document I recognized. It was a deed transfer for the Asheville property. Signed, notarized, and dated 6 weeks earlier. Signed with my name. Except I had never signed it. The second was a printed email chain between my husband and someone named D. Hargrove. Subject line: estate transition timeline. I read enough to understand that D. Hargrove was a real estate attorney, that the estate transition referred to my land, and that my husband had been in communication with this person for at least 8 months. One email near the bottom, from my husband, read, "She doesn't have any other family to notice. We have the window. Let's not waste it. She doesn't have any other family to notice." I read that sentence 4 times. Each time it landed differently. The 5th time I read it, I felt something in my chest go very, very quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a sound that changes everything. The third item was a small orange prescription bottle. My name on the label. A medication I had never been prescribed, never filled, never taken. I photographed all of it with my phone, hands steadier than I expected, because I think by that point some part of me had already known. Had known for weeks, maybe months, and had simply been waiting for the evidence to catch up. I put everything back, relocked the drawer, replaced the key, and went to lie back down next to a man who had forged my signature, who was planning to transfer my land out from under me, who had a bottle of unprescribed medication with my name on it, and who had said nothing when his mother knocked a mug of bitter-smelling tea off my hands on my birthday. I didn't sleep, but I didn't run either, because if I ran, I'd have nothing but a drawer full of photographs and a gut feeling. I needed more. I needed my best friend. Her name is Delphine, and she's the kind of person who, when you call her at 6 in the morning and say, "I think something is very wrong," doesn't ask questions first. She just says, "Tell me where you are." I drove to her apartment while my husband was still asleep, took the long way in case I was followed, and sat at her kitchen table, shaking slightly, while she made actual tea chamomile, no additives. I checked the mug myself and then felt absurd for checking, and I laid everything out for her. She listened without interrupting. That's one of the things I love most about Delphine. She listens like it matters. When I finished, she sat for a long moment, then she said, "Mara, that prescription bottle. What was the medication?" I pulled up the photo on my phone and read her the name. She went still in a way I hadn't seen before. Then she stood, walked to her laptop, and started typing. After a minute, she turned the screen toward me. A medical forum. A thread about the drug, its uses, its side effects, and buried in the middle of the thread, a question from 3 years ago. Someone asking whether long-term, low-dose exposure could cause symptoms that mimicked chronic illness. Whether it could cause someone to seem sick without a definitive diagnosis. I thought about the past 18 months. The fatigue I'd chalked up to stress, the dizzy spells my doctor had attributed to low blood pressure. The afternoon last spring when I'd fainted in the parking lot of the grocery store and my husband had been so concerned, so attentive, had held my hand in the ER and asked all the right questions. The doctor said I was probably just dehydrated. I sat at Delphine's kitchen table and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like cold water, that I might have been sick because someone was making me sick. That the window my husband had written about wasn't just about the land transfer. It was about me. A woman with no family, no witnesses, a history of mysterious health issues, and a piece of valuable property that would transfer to her husband upon her death. "We need a lawyer," Delphine said. "We need more than that," I said. "We need everything." Over the next 4 days, while I went home every night and behaved as though nothing had changed, Delphine and I built the case. She had a contact from her old job. She used to work in insurance before she switched careers, a man named Patrick, who now did forensic accounting for a private investigations firm. We paid him out of Delphine's savings because I didn't dare touch a joint account. Within 48 hours, Patrick had pulled enough to make our blood run cold. The Asheville property had already been listed. Not on a public real estate site, a private listing, through a development LLC that had been incorporated 4 months ago. One of the 2 listed directors of that LLC was my mother-in-law. The other was Dee Hargrove, the attorney from the email chain. My mother-in-law wasn't just a bystander. She was a co-director on the company that was set to receive the proceeds from the fraudulent sale of my land. She had been in this from the beginning. I thought about every birthday she'd made me tea. Every holiday she'd insisted on cooking. Wouldn't let me near the stove, always doing something nice. I thought about how she'd started staying over more frequently in the last year, always with a good reason, always with warmth and gifts and plausible cover. I didn't sleep that night either. But this time, it wasn't fear keeping me awake, it was focus. On the 3rd day, Delphine found something that shattered what was left of my ability to be surprised. She'd been digging through old property filings and came across a name. The original LLC that had first approached my father about buying the Asheville land years ago, before he died, an offer he'd rejected was tied through a chain of shell companies to a firm called Hargrove and Associates. The same Dee Hargrove, my mother-in-law's co-director. They hadn't found me by accident. They hadn't stumbled into my life through a mutual friend at a dinner party. The connection to my land had existed before my husband ever walked into that room and asked me questions and listened to the answers like they mattered. I sat with that for a long time. The dinner party, the wine, the way he'd made me feel seen. Every memory rearranged itself into something else. Not a love story, a long con. And I had been the mark from the beginning. I called in sick to work. I drove to the property records office and obtained a certified copy of the real deed, the original, in my name, unaltered. Then I drove to a pharmacy I had never used before and paid cash for a drug test kit. Then I went to a clinic 2 towns over, told them I had concerns about possible exposure to a substance, and asked for a full tox panel. They drew blood without asking many questions, which I was grateful for. I went home. I made dinner. I smiled. My husband asked how my day was, and I said fine, a little tired, maybe coming down with something. He put his hand on my forehead the way you do with a child. I let him. 2 days later, the tox results came back. Traces. Not a massive amount enough to explain the fatigue and the dizzy spells and the fainting, but the kind of level that builds slowly, that you'd only catch if you were specifically looking. The clinic doctor called me and said she wanted to follow up, that this was unusual, that she had some concerns. I told her I would come in. I did not tell her yet what I suspected. I needed one more thing first. I needed it on record. I went back to Delphine with the tox results, the certified deed copy, the photographed documents from the drawer, Patrick's financial findings, and a timeline I'd written out across 4 pages in a notebook. We sat across from each other at her kitchen table for 3 hours and organized everything into a sequence that told a story anyone could follow. Then I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, Delphine's cousin, who did criminal defense and knew exactly which DA's office to contact and exactly how to walk into that office in a way that made people take you seriously. The next morning, I sat in a conference room with 2 detectives and an assistant district attorney, and I laid every piece of it on the table. The forged deed. The LLC, the tox panel, the emails, the prescription bottle, the mother-in-law who knocked tea from my hands and didn't flinch. They were quiet for a moment. Then one of the detectives looked at the other and said, "Hargrove again." It turned out Dee Hargrove had been on their radar for 2 years for a different matter, a similar property fraud involving an elderly widower in a neighboring county. They hadn't been able to build enough to move. What I handed them that morning was the thread they'd been missing. Everything after that moved faster than I expected. I went home that afternoon, packed what mattered most into a bag I kept at Delphine's. Went through the motions of 2 more ordinary evenings: dinner, conversation, television, good night. I was performing, and I was good at it, because I had spent 3 years in a performance I didn't know I was in, and it turns out that's useful training. On the 4th day after my meeting with the detectives, I got a text from my lawyer. 1 word: tomorrow. That evening, my husband told me he needed to run an errand. He'd be back in an hour. I said, sure. Take your time. The moment his car left the driveway, I sent Delphine a message. Then I sat in the kitchen, completely still, and waited. He came back 40 minutes later. His mother was with him. They came in through the garage entrance, which was unusual, and they were speaking in low voices that stopped when they heard me in the kitchen. He recovered fast, smiled. Said she'd wanted to drop off some things, offered to make coffee. She set a paper bag on the counter and kept her eyes away from mine. I stood up and said, very calmly, I found the drawer. No one moved. I found the deed. I found the emails. I found the prescription bottle. I had a tox panel run. I know what's in my blood. I know about Hargrove and Associates, and I know about the LLC. And I know you've been planning this since before we met. I looked at my husband. I know you were sent to find me. He went through 3 expressions in about 4 seconds. Surprise. Then the rapid calculation of someone trying to figure out what I actually had, then something colder, more controlled. He said, Mara, I don't know what you think you found, but don't, I said. My mother-in-law made a move toward the paper bag on the counter. I stepped sideways, putting myself between her and it. I didn't know what was in it. I didn't want to find out. That's when the front door opened. 2 detectives. My lawyer behind them. A 3rd officer through the garage entrance who my mother-in-law turned to find standing directly in her path. My husband's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went empty, not afraid, not angry, just blank, like a screen that's been switched off. His mother sat down in a kitchen chair, like her legs had stopped working. The detectives were professional and efficient. There were handcuffs and Miranda rights, and the particular bureaucratic calm of people who have done this many times and understand that calm is what the moment requires. My lawyer stood next to me and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Hargrove was arrested at his office the same morning. I found out later, through my lawyer, that when the detectives walked in he'd apparently been on the phone. He ended the call when he saw them. Sat down. Said, I was wondering when this would happen. That was it. 3 years of planning, a forged deed, a slow poisoning, a company built to launder the proceeds of my land, and his response was that he'd been expecting company. The widower in the neighboring county got his property back. There were 2 other cases that surfaced in the months that followed, families in similar situations who hadn't known yet that they'd been targeted. The network was larger than I'd understood when I first sat down with those detectives. My land had been one piece of something much bigger. The land is still mine. I drove out to Asheville 3 months after the arrests, alone, on a Tuesday morning when the weather was still cool enough that the mountains had that particular gray-blue color they get in early spring. I parked on the road and walked the edge of the property and just stood there for a while. It's beautiful. My grandmother knew what she was doing when she held on to it. I thought about my mother, who had held on to it after her. I thought about how she'd always said, the land is yours, Mara. It's always going to be yours. Like she knew someone might try to take it someday. Like she was trying to remind me in advance. I stayed until the light changed. Then I got back in the car and drove home. Here is what I want you to understand. I spent a long time after the arrests trying to identify the exact moment I had known. The moment I should have known. I kept reaching back to the tea, to the overheard phone call, to the dizzy spells, further back to little moments in our marriage where something had felt slightly off, but I'd covered it over with explanations. With love. With the reasonable human desire to believe that the person sleeping next to you is who they say they are. And I realized there's no useful answer to that question. I didn't know because I wasn't supposed to know. They were good. They had done this before. The warmth was practiced. The charm was deliberate. And I was a woman without family, which made me, in their calculations, a woman without witnesses. What I want to say to you, if you're listening to this and something feels wrong, not dramatic, not obvious, just a small, cold thing lodged behind your sternum that you can't quite swallow, I want you to take it seriously. You don't need proof to ask questions. You don't need certainty to start looking. The instinct that something is wrong is its own kind of evidence. Don't file it away. Don't cover it over. Because the hardest part of this whole thing was not the detectives, and not the courtroom, and not learning that my marriage had been a construction built around what I owned. The hardest part was that moment in Delphine's kitchen, at 6 in the morning, when I had to decide. I almost didn't. I almost went back to bed. I am so glad I didn't go back to bed. My grandmother held onto that land for decades because she believed it would matter someday. She was right. And I held on to it not because I'm exceptional, not because I was prepared, but because when the moment came and I was standing in a locked office at 2 in the morning with a phone in my hand and photographs of a forged deed on my screen, I chose to believe what I was seeing. I chose myself. And this story, the one that started with a cup of tea, I almost drank, ends with me standing on a hillside in Asheville, watching the mountains go blue. In the early spring light, on land that belongs to me, that has always belonged to me, that will belong to whoever comes after me. They thought I was alone. They were wrong.